Welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. This is Jeff from Trevessence, and this morning we're going to continue with the reading of Spare, the book written by Prince Harry. So far, we've done about 5 episodes. So if you are new here and you have not yet listened to the previous episodes, it would be a good thing to go back and listen to them and then try to catch up with us. This morning, we are going to move on with chapter 6, it is chapter 36. I mean, forgive me, guys, it's early in the morning. It's chapter 36 or page 36, whichever it is, because I'm reading from my Kindle, so I'm not sure, but I'm going to call it chapter 36. All right, so come on with me, guys, and let me read with you, to you, and for us. It's my absolute pleasure. And I hope you all are enjoying me read. Now I'm going to go back a little bit into 35 before I hop over into 36. And this is where the Queen's mom had passed away. Your Royal Highness, the Queen Mother has died. Cut to Willie and me, days later, dark suits, downcast faces, eyes filled with deja vu. We walked slowly behind the gun carriage, bagpipes playing, hundreds of them. The sound threw me back in time. I began shaking. Once again, we made that hideous trek to Westminster Abbey. Then we stepped into the car, joined the cortege. From the center of town, along Whitehall, out to the Mall, on to St. George's Chapel. Throughout that morning, my eye kept going to the top of Gongang's coffin, where they had set the crown. Its 3,000 diamonds and jeweled cross winked in the spring sunlight. At the center of the cross was a diamond the size of a cricket ball. Not just a diamond, actually, the great diamond of the world, a 105-carat monster called the Koh-i-Noor. Longest diamond ever seen by human eyes, quote unquote, acquired by the British Empire at its zenith. Stolen, some thought. I'd heard it was mesmerizing, and I'd heard it was cursed. Men fought for it, died for it, and thus the curse was said to be masculine. Only women were permitted to wear it. 36. Strange, after so much mourning, to start party. But months later came the Golden Jubilee, 50th anniversary of Granny's reign. Over 4 years, that summer of 2002, Willie and I were constantly pulling on another set of smart clothes, jumping into another black car, rushing to yet another venue for another party or parade, reception or gala. Britain was intoxicated. People did jigs in the streets, sang from balconies and rooftops. Everyone wore some version of the Union Jack. In a nation known for its reticence, this was a startling expression of unbridled joy. Startling to me anyway. Granny didn't seem startled. I was startled at how unstartled she was. It wasn't that she felt no emotions. On the contrary, I always thought that Granny experienced all the normal human emotions. She just knew better than the rest of us mortals how to control them. I stood beside or behind her through much of the Golden Jubilee weekend, and I often thought, if this can't shake her, then she's truly earned her reputation for imperturbable serenity. In which case, I thought, maybe I'm a foundling, because I'm a nervous wreck. There were several reasons for my nerves, but the main one was a brewing scandal. Just before the Jubilee, I'd been summoned by one of the courtiers of this little office, and without much building, he'd ask, "Harry, are you doing cocaine?" Shades of my lunch with Marco. What? Am I? How could, no? Well, could there be a photo out there? Is it possible that someone somewhere might have a photo of you doing cocaine? God, no, that's ridiculous. Why? He explained that he had been approached by a newspaper editor who claimed to have come into possession of a photo showing Prince Harry snorting a line. He's a liar. It's not true. I see. But that as it may, this editor is willing to lock the photo into his safe forever. But in exchange, he wants to sit down with you and explain that what you are doing is very damaging. He wants to give you some life advice. Oh, creepy and devious, diabolical even. In fact, because if I agree to this meeting, then I'm admitting guilt. Right? I told myself, after Rehabber Cooks, they all want to go at me. She'd scored a direct hit, and now her competitors are lining up to be next. When will it end? I reassured myself that the editor had nothing, that he was just fishing. He must have heard a rumor and he was tracking it down. Stay the course, I told myself, and then I told the courtier to call the journalist bluff, vigorously refute the claim, turn down the deal. Above all, reject the proffered meeting. I'm not going to submit to blackmail. The courtier nodded. Done. Of course, I had been doing cocaine around this time at someone's country house during a shooting weekend. I'd been offered a line, and I'd done a few more since. It wasn't much fun, and it didn't make me particularly happy, as it seemed to make everyone around me. But it did make me feel different, and that was the main goal. Feel different. I was a deeply unhappy 17-year-old boy, willing to try almost anything that would alter the status quo. That was what I told myself anyway. Back then, I could lie to myself as effortlessly as I'd lied to that courtier. But now I realized Coke hadn't been worth the candle. The risk far outweighed the reward. Threatened, threatened with exposure, faced with the prospect of fouling up Granny's golden jubilee, walking a knife's edge with the mad press, nothing was worth any of that. On the bright side, I'd played the game well. After I'd called the journalist bluff, he went silent. As suspected, he had no photo, and when his con game didn't work, he slithered off. Or quite not. He slithered into Clarence's house and became very good friends with Camilla and Pa. I was ashamed for lying, but also proud. In my tight spot, a hugely scary crisis, I hadn't felt any serenity, like Granny, but at least I'd managed to project it. I channeled some of her superpower, her heroic stoicism. I regretted giving the courtier a cockamamie story, but the alternative would have been 10 times worse. So, job well done? Maybe I wasn't a fondling after all. Okay, we're continuing to read. Now we're on to chapter 37. There was a little blunder right there, my friends. I'm not sure what happened, but we're back in studio. So let us continue. On Tuesday, the culminating day of the Jubilee, millions watched Granny go from palace to church, a special Thanksgiving service. She rode with Grandpa in a carriage of gold, all of it, every square inch, luxurious gold, lustrous gold, gold doors, gold wheels, gold roof, and on top of it all, a gold crown held aloft by three angels cast in glowing gold. The carriage was built 13 years before the American Revolution and still ran like a top. As it sped her and Grandpa through the streets, somewhere in the distance, a massive choir blasted the coronation anthem. Rejoice, rejoice. We did, we did. For even the grumpiest anti monarchist, it was hard not to feel at least one goosebump. There was a luncheon that day, I think, and a dinner party, but it all felt a bit anticlimactic. The main event, everyone acknowledged, had taken place the night before in the gardens outside Buckingham Palace, a performance by some of the greatest musical artists of the century. Paul McCartney sang Her Majesty. Brian May on the roof played God Save the Queen. How marvelous, many said, and how miraculous that Granny should be so hip, so modern, that she should allow, indeed relish, all this modern rock. Sitting directly behind her, I couldn't help thinking the same thing. To see her tapping her foot and swaying in time, I wanted to hug her, though of course I didn't. Out of the question. I never had done and couldn't imagine any circumstance under which such an act would be sanctioned. There was a famous story about Mummy trying to hug Granny. It was actually more a lunge than a hug, if eyewitnesses can be believed. Granny swerved to avoid contact, and the whole thing ended very awkwardly, with averted eyes and murmured apologies. Every time I tried to picture the scene, it reminded me of a thwarted pickpocketing or a rugby top tackle. I wondered, watching Granny rock out to Brian May, if Pa ever tried. Probably not. When he was 5 or 6, Granny left him, went off on a royal tour lasting several months, and when she returned, she offered him a firm handshake, which may have been more than he ever got from Grandpa. Indeed, Grandpa was so aloof, so busy traveling and working, he barely saw Pa for the first several years of his life. Oh, wow. Oh, wow, guys. I have to stop here. The royal existence is really lonely. No wonder I believe so many of them seem so distant. It's not now I believe it's not us. It's not that they're being so aloof that they are not in touch with the reality of the rest of the world. But I think that it is even the reality of themselves with which they are not so in touch because it seems to make them inhumane. That's just my thought. Because to think that you can't hug your dad, you can't hug your mom, you can't hug your child because of some kind of rule of the monarchy. It definitely seems to me like that would make you become not necessarily cold hearted, but just so distant from humanity. And if you don't have the expressions of humanity that encourages love and loyalty in your own home, in your own life, how are you supposed to extend that to the wider world? Wow. Let us continue. As the concert went on, I began to feel tired. I had a headache from the loud music and from the stress of the last few weeks. Granny, however, showed no signs of fading, still going strong, still tapping and swaying. Suddenly, I looked closer. I noticed something in her ears. Something gold, gold as the golden carriage, gold as the golden angels. I leaned forward. Maybe not quite gold. No, maybe it was more yellow. Yes, yellow earplugs. I looked into my lap and smiled. When I lifted my head again, I watched with glee as Granny kept time to music she couldn't hear, or music she had found a clever and subtle way to, to distance herself from. Controlling. More than ever before, I wanted to give my granny a hug. I sat down with Pa that summer, possibly at Balmoral, though it might have been Clarence House, where he was now living more or less full time. He had moved in shortly after Grangang's death, and wherever he lived, I lived. When I wasn't living at Manor House, my final year at Eton drawing near, Pa wanted to chat about how I envisioned my life post Eton. Most of my mates would be headed off to university. Willie was already at St. Andrews and thriving. Henners had just finished his A levels at Horror School and was planning to go to Newcastle. And now, darling boy, have you given any thought to the future? Why, yes, yes, I had. For several years, I talked in all seriousness about working at the ski resort in Lekon Alberg, where Mummy used to take us. Such wonderful memories. Specifically, I wanted to work at the fondue hut in the center of town, which Mummy loved. That fondue could change your life. I really was that mad. But now I told Pa I'd given up the fondue fantasy, and he sighed with relief. Instead, I was taken with notions of becoming a ski instructor. Pa tensed again. Out of the question. Okay. Long pause. How about a safari guide? No, darling boy. This wasn't going to be easy. Part of me really did want to do something totally outside the box. Something that would make everyone in the family, in the country, sit up and say, What the? Part of me wanted to drop out, disappear, as Mommy did, and other princes. Wasn't there one in India a long time ago? A bloke who just walked out of his palace and sat under a lovely banyan tree? We'd read about him at school, or we were supposed to. But another part of me felt hugely ambitious. People assumed that the spare wouldn't or shouldn't have any ambition. People assumed that royals generally had no career, desires, or anxieties. You are royal. Everything's done for you. Why worry? But in fact, I worried quite a lot about making my own way, finding my purpose in this world. I didn't want to be one of those cocktail slurping, eye rolling, causing slots everybody avoided at family gatherings. There had been plenty of those in my family going back centuries. Pa, in fact, might have been one. He had always been discouraged from hard work, he told me. He had been advised that the heir shouldn't do too much, shouldn't try too hard, for fear of outshining the monarch. But he had rebelled, listened to his inner voice, discovered work that excited him. He wanted that for me. That was why he didn't press me to go to university. He knew it wasn't in my DNA. Not that I was anti university per se. In fact, the University of Bristol looked interesting. I pored over its literature, even considered a course in art history. Lots of pretty girls took that subject, but I just couldn't picture myself spending years bent over a book. My Eton housemaster couldn't either. He had told me straight out, You are not the university type. You are not the university type, Harry. No, Pa added his essence. It was not secret, he said gently, that I wasn't the family scholar. He didn't mean it as a dig. Still, I winced. He and I went around and around, and in my head I went back and forth, and by a process of elimination, we landed on the army. It made sense. It aligned with my desire to be outside the box, to disappear. The military would take me away from the prying eyes of the public and the press. But it also fitted with my hope of making a difference. and it accorded with my personality. My prized toys as a boy had always been miniature soldiers. I'd spent thousands of hours planning and waging epic battles with them at Kensington Palace and in Highgrove's Rosemary Very designed gardens. I'd also treated every game of paintball as though the future of the Commonwealth depended on the outcome. Pa smiled. Yes, darling boy, the army sounds like just the thing. But first, he added, many people took a gap year as a matter of course. Pa, however, considered a gap year to be one of the most formative periods in a person's life. See the world, darling boy. Have adventures. So I sat down with Marco and tried to decide what those adventures might look like. We settled first on Australia, spent half the year working on a farm. Excellent. As for the second half of the year, Africa. I told Marco I'd like to join the fight against AIDS, that this would be an homage to Mommy, an explicit continuation of her work, didn't need to be spelt out. Marco went away, did some research, came back to me and said, Lesotho. Never heard of it, I confessed. He educated me. Landlocked country, lovely country, bordering South Africa, lots of need, loads of work to be done. I was overjoyed. A plan at last. Soon after, I visited Hennes, a weekend in Edinburgh, autumn 2002. We went to a restaurant and I told him all about it. Good for you, Haz. He was taking a gap year as well in East Africa, Uganda, as I recall, working in a rural school. At the moment, however, he was working a part-time job at Ludgrove, working as a stooge, the Ludgrovian word for handyman. It was a very cool job, he said. He got to be with kids, got to fix things all over the grounds. Plus, I teased him. All the free strawberries and carrots you can eat. But he was quite serious about it. I like teaching Haz. I like it. Oh, oops. Oh, we talked excitingly about Africa, made plans to meet up there. After Uganda, after college, Hens too would probably go into the army. He was going to be a green jacket. He w- he wasn't real. It wasn't really a decision. His family had been in uniform for generations. He talked about meeting up there too. Maybe, we said, we'll find ourselves side by side one day, marching into battle or helping people on the other side of the world. The future. We wondered aloud what it held. I worried about it, but not Hennes. He didn't take the future seriously, didn't take anything seriously. Life as it comes has, that was Hennes, always and forever. I envied his tranquility. And now, however, he was heading to one of Edinburgh's casinos. He asked if I wanted to come along. I can't, I said. I couldn't possibly be seen in a casino. It would cause a huge scandal. Too bad, he said. Cheers, we both said, promising to talk again soon. 2 months later, a Sunday morning, just before Christmas of 2002, the news must have come in the form of a phone call, though I only dimly recall holding the phone, hearing the words. Henners and another boy, leaving a party near Ludgrove, drove into a tree. Though the call's a blur, I vividly remember my reaction, same as when Pa told me about Mummy. Right, so Henners was in an accident, but he's in the hospital, right? He's going to be okay. No, he wasn't. And the other boy, the driver, had been critically injured. Willie and I went to the funeral, a little parish church down the road from where Henners grew up. I remember hundreds of people squeezing into creaky wooden pews. I remember, after the service, keying up to hug Henners' parents, Alex and Claire, and his brothers, Thomas and Charlie. I think while we waited, I overheard whispered discussions of the crash. It was foggy, you know. They weren't going far, but they but where were they going? And at that time of night, they were at a party and the sound system was knackered. So they ran off to get another. No, they went to borrow a CD player from a friend. Short distance, you know. So they didn't bother with seatbelts, just like Mummy. And yet, unlike Mummy, there was no way to spin this as a disappearance. This was death. No two ways about it. Also, unlike Mummy, Henners wasn't going that fast because he wasn't being chased. 20 miles an hour tops, everyone said, and yet the car went straight into an old tree. Old ones, someone explained, are much harder than young ones. 13:9. They wouldn't let me out of Eton until I acted. They that was what they said. I needed to take part in one of their formal dramas before they'd punch my ticket and release me into the wild. Harry being released into the wild again. All right. Just like what happened behind that pub in the grassy field with that older woman who smacked him on the butt and sent him off. Oh boy. It sounded ridiculous, but theatre was deadly serious at Eton. The drama department staged several productions each year, and the year-end production was always the most major of them all. In the late spring of 2003, it was Shakespeare Much Ado About Nothing. I was cast as Conrad. Minor character, he was perhaps a drinker, perhaps a drunkard, which gave the press all sorts of clever openings for calling me a drunkard too. What's this? Bit of typecasting, is it? Stories wrote themselves. Eton's drama teacher said nothing about typecasting when he gave me the role. He just told me I was Conrad. Have fun with it, Harry. And I didn't question his motives. I wouldn't have questioned them even if I'd suspected it was taking the piss. Because I wanted to get out of Eton, and to get out of Eton, you had to act. Among other things, I learned from studying the play that it was wrong-headed and reductive to focus on Conrad's alcohol consumption. He was a fascinating guy, really, loyal, but also immoral, full of advice, but essentially a follower. Above all, he was a henchman, a sidekick, whose main function seemingly was to give the audience a laugh or two. I found it easy to throw myself into such a role and discovered during dress rehearsals that I had a hidden talent. Being royal, it turned out, wasn't all that far from being on stage. Acting was acting, no matter the context. Opening night, my father sat dead center in the packed Fair Theatre, and no one had a better time. Here it was, his dream come true. A son performing Shakespeare, and he was getting his money's worth. He roared, he howled, he applauded, but inexplicably at all the wrong moments. His timing was bizarrely off. He sat mute when everyone else was laughing. He laughed when everyone else was silent. More than noticeable, it was bloody distracting. The audience thought Pa was a plant, part of the performance. Who's that over there, laughing at nothing? Oh, is that the Prince of Wales? Later, backstage, Pa was all compliments. You were wonderful, darling boy. But I couldn't help looking cross. What's the matter, darling boy? Pa, you laughed at all the wrong times. He was baffled. I was too. How could he have no idea what I was talking about? Slowly it became clear. He had told me once that, when he was my age, acting in his own school performance of Shakespeare, Grandpa turned up and did exactly the same thing, laughed at all the wrong times, made a complete spectacle. Was Pa modeling his own father because he knew no other way to parent? Or was it more subliminal, some recessive genes expressing itself? In each generation, is each generation doomed to unwittingly repeat the sins of the last? I wanted to know, and I might have asked, but that wasn't the sort of thing you could ever raise with Pa or Grandpa, so I put it out of my mind and tried to focus on the good. Pa is here, I told myself, and he's proud, and that's not nothing. That was more than a lot of kids had. I thanked him. I thanked him for coming, gave him a kiss on each cheek. As Conrad says, can you make no use of your discontent? Welcome into the live, guys. We are continuing to read the book Spare, written by Prince Harry. For those of you who have been following me read this book, I hope you are enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying reading it for you, with you, to you, for us, to us. Let us continue. We are on to chapter 40. I completed my education at Eton in June of 2003, thanks to hours of hard work and some extra tutoring arranged by Pa. No small feat for one so unscholarly, so limited, so distracted. And while I wasn't proud of myself exactly, because I didn't know how to be proud of myself, I felt a distinct pause in my non-stop internal self-criticism. And then I was accused of cheating. An art teacher came forward with evidence of cheating, which turned out not to be evidence of cheating. It turned out to be nothing at all, and I was later cleared by the exam board. But the damage was done. The accusation stuck. Broken-hearted, I wanted to release a statement, hold a press conference, tell the world, I did the work. I didn't cheat. The palace wouldn't let me. In this, as in most things, the palace stuck fast to the family's motto, never explain, especially if the complainer was an 18-year-old boy. Thus, I was forced to sit by and say nothing while the papers called me a cheat and a dummy every day. Because of an art project, I mean, how do you cheat on an art project? This was the official start of that dreaded title, Prince Thicko, just as I was cast as comrade without my consultation or consent. I was now cast in this role. The difference was we did much ado about nothing for 3 nights. This had the look of a role that would last a lifetime. Prince Harry? Oh, yeah, not too bright. Can't pass a simple test without cheating. That's what I read. I talked to Pa about it. I was near despair. He said what he always said. Darling boy, just don't read it. He never read it. He read everything else, from Shakespeare to white papers on climate change, but never the news. He did watch the BBC, but he'd often end up throwing the controller at the TV. The problem was, everyone else read it. Everyone in my family claimed not to, just like Pa. But even as they were making this claim to your face, liveried footmen were bustling around them, fanning every British newspaper across silver platters, as neatly as the scones and marmalades. 41. The farm was called Tulumbia. The people who owned it were the Hills. Noel and Annie. They had been friends of Mummy. Annie had been Mummy's flatmate when she first started dating Pa. Marco helped me find them and somehow persuaded them to let me be their unpaid summer jackaroo. The Hills had 3 children, Nikki, Eustace, and George. The eldest, George, was exactly my age, though he looked much older, perhaps due to years and years of toil under the boiling Australian sun. Upon arriving, I learned that George would be my mentor, my boss, my headmaster in a way, though Tulumbia was nothing like Eton. In fact, it was like no place I'd ever been. I came from a green place. The Hills farm was an ode to Brown. I came from a place where every move was monitored, catalogued, and subjected to judgment. The Hills farm was so vast and remote that no one would see me for most of each day but George and the odd wallaby. Above all, I came from a place that was temperate, rainy, cool. The Hills farm was hot. I wasn't sure I could endure this kind of heat. The Australian outback had a climate I didn't understand and which my body couldn't seem to accept. Like Pa, I wilted at the mere mention of heat. How was I supposed to put up with an oven inside a blast furnace, inside a nuclear reactor set on top of an active volcano? Bad spot for me, but worse for my bodyguards, those poor lads, of all the assignments. Plus, their lodging was extra Spartan, an outbuilding on the edge of the farm. I rarely saw them and often imagined them out there, sitting in their briefs before a noisy electric fan, grumpily polishing their CVs. The Hills let me bunk with them in the main house, a sweet little bungalow with white clapboards, wooden steps leading to the wide porch, a front door that gave out a kittenish squeak every time you pulled it open, and loud bang every time you let it fly shut. The door had a tight screen to keep out mosquitoes, which were big as birds. That first night, sitting over dinner, I couldn't hear anything but the rhythmic slap of bloodsuckers against mesh. There wasn't much else to hear. We were all a bit awkward, trying to pretend that I was a jackaroo, not a prince, trying to pretend that we weren't thinking about Mummy, who had loved Annie and whom Annie had loved in return. Annie clearly wanted to talk about Mummy, but as with Willie, I just couldn't. So I shoveled in the food and praised it and asked for seconds and searched my brain for antidote topics of conversation. But I couldn't think of any. The heart had already impaired my cognitive skills. Falling asleep those first nights in the outback, I'd conjured up the image of Marco and worriedly asked him, "Did we really think this through, mate?" 42. The remedy of all problems, as always, was work. Hard, sweaty, non-stop labor. That was what the Hills had to offer, and plenty of it, and I couldn't get enough. The harder I worked, the less I felt the heat, and the easier it was to talk or not talk around the super table. But this wasn't merely work. Being a jackaroo required stamina, to be sure, but it also demanded a certain artistry. You had to be a whisperer with the animals. You had to be a reader of the skies and the land. You also had to possess a superior level of horsemanship. I'd come to Australia thinking I knew my way around horses, but the Hills were Huns, each born in a saddle. Noel was the son of a professional polo player. He had been Pa's former polo coach, and he could stroke a horse's nose and tell you what that beast was thinking. And George climbed into a saddle more easily than most people got into a chair or their beds. I typically worked day. A typical work day began in the middle of the night. Hours before dawn, George and I would stumble outside, tackle the first chores, trying to get as much done as possible before the sun ascended. At first light, we'd saddle up, gallop to the edges of the hills, 40,000 acres, double the size of Balmoral, and begin to muster. That is, move the herd of cattle from here to there. We had also searched for individual cows that had strayed overnight and drive them back into the herd, or load some onto a trailer and take them to another section. I rarely knew exactly why we were moving these cows or those, but I got the bottom line. Cows need their space. I felt them. Whenever George and I found a group of strays, a rebellious little cattle cabal, that was especially challenging. It was vital to keep them together. If they scattered, we'd be proper fucked. It would it would take hours to round them up and then the day would be wrecked. If one darted off into a stand of trees, say, George or I would have to ride full speed after it. Every now and then, mid chase, you'd get whipped out of the saddle by a low hanging branch, maybe knocked cold. When you came to, you do a check for broken bones, internal bleeding, while your horse stood morosely over you. The trick was never letting a chase last too long. Long chases wore out the cow, reduced its body fat, slashed its market value. Fat was money, and there was no margin for error with Aussie's cattle, which had so little fat to begin with. Water was scarce, grass was scarce, and what little there was often got grubbed by kangaroos, which George and his family viewed as other people view rats. I always flinched and chuckled at the way George spoke to errant cattle. He harangued them, abused them, cursed them, favored one curse word in particular, a word many people go a lifetime without using. George couldn't do 5 minutes. Most people dive under a table when they hear this word, but for George, it was the Swiss Army knife of language. Endless applications and uses. He also made it sound almost charming with his Aussie accent. It was merely one of dozens of words in the complete George lexicon. For instance, a fat was a plump cow ready for slaughter. A steer was a young bull that could have been castrated but hadn't yet been. A weaner was a calf newly split from its mother. A smoke was a cigarette break. Tucker was food. I spent a lot of late 2003 sitting high in the saddle, watching a weaner while sucking a smoko and dreaming of the next tucker. Sometimes hard, sometimes tedious, mustering could be unexpectedly emotional. Young females were easier. They went where you nudged them. But young males didn't care for being bossed around. And what they really didn't like was being split from their moms. They cried, moaned, sometimes charged you. A wildly slung horn could ruin a limb or sever an artery. But I wasn't afraid. Instead, I was empathetic. And the young males seemed to know. The one job I wouldn't do, the one piece of hard work I shied from, was snipping balls. Every time George brought out that long, shiny blade, I'd raise my hands. No, mate, can't do it. Suit yourself. At day's end, I'd take a scalding shower, eat a gargantuan supper, then sit with George on the porch, rolling cigarettes, sipping cold beers. Sometimes we'd listen to this small CD player, which made me think of Pa's Wireless or Hennes. He and the other boy went to borrow another CD player. Often we'd just sit gazing into the distance. The land was so tabletop flat, you could see thunderstorms brewing hours ahead of when they arrived. The first spidery boats flickering the far-off land. As the boats got thicker and closer, wind would race through the house, ruffling the curtains. Then the rooms would flutter with white light. The first thunderclaps would shake the furniture. Finally, the deluge. George would sigh. His parents would sigh. Rain was grass. Rain was fat. Rain was money. If it didn't rain, that also felt like a blessing, because after a windstorm, the clear sky would be peppered with stars. I'd point out to George what the gang in Botswana had pointed out to me. See that bright one next to the moon? That's Venus. And over there, that's Scorpius. Best place to see it is in the southern hemisphere, and Pleiades, and there's Pleiades, and that's Sirius, brightest star in the sky. And there's Orion, the hunter. All comes down to hunting, doesn't it? Hunters hunt. What's that, Harry? Nothing, mate. The thing I found endlessly mesmerizing about the stars was how far away they all were. The light you saw was born hundreds of centuries ago. In other words, looking at a star, you were looking at the past, at a time long before anyone you knew or loved had lived, or died, or disappeared. George and I usually hit the sack about 8:30. Often we were too tired to take off our clothes. I was no longer afraid of the dark. I craved it. I slept as if I slept as if dead, woke as if reborn, sore but ready for more. There were no days off between the relentless work, the relentless heat, the relentless cows. I could feel myself being whittled down, lighter each morning by a kilo, quieter by a few dozen words. Even my British accent was being pared away. After 6 weeks, I sounded nothing like Willie and Pa. I sounded more like George, and dressed a bit like him as well. I took a wearing to slouchy felt cowboy hat like his. I carried one of his old leather whips. Finally, to go with this new Harry, I acquired a new name, Spike. Here is Harry going from spare to Spike, guys. Oh well. Sister Winsome is in the house. How are you doing, my sweetheart? A very happy Tuesday morning to you, my love. Today, yes, sis. So I'm getting it in because tomorrow I'll be back to the grind. I guess by now y'all know my pattern. When I'm off of work, that's when I put in the most. When I'm working, that's when you all don't see much of me. And I guess that's how it is. All right, let us continue. It happened like this. My hair had never fully recovered after I'd let my Eton schoolmates shave it. Some strands shot up like summer grass, some lay flat, like Lucker's hay. George often pointed at my head and said, "You look a right mess." But on a trip to Sydney to see the Rugby World Cup, I'd made an official appearance at the Taronga Zoo, and I had been asked to pose for a photo with something called an echidna, a cross between a hedgehog and an anteater. It had hard, spiky hair, which was why the zookeepers named me Spike. It looked, as George would say, a right mess. More to the point, it looked like me, a lot like me. And when George happened to see a photo of me posing with Spike, he yelled, "Has that thing's got your hair?" Thereafter, he never called me anything but Spike. And then my bodyguards took up the chorus. Indeed, they made Spike my code name on the radio. Some even printed up T-shirts, which they wore while guarding me. Spike 2003. Soon enough, my mates at home got wind of it. They got wind of my new nickname and adopted it. I became Spike. When I wasn't Haz, or Baz, or Prince Jackaroo, or Harold, or Darling Boy, or Scrawny, a nickname given to me by some palace staff, identity had always been problematic. But with a half dozen formal names and a full dozen nicknames, it was turning into a hall of mirrors. Most days I didn't care what people called me. Most days I thought, don't care who I am, as long as it's someone new, someone other than Prince Harry. But then an official package would arrive from London, from the palace, and the old me, the old life, the royal life, would come racing back. The packet usually arrived in the everyday mail, though sometimes it was under the arm of a new bodyguard. There was a constant change of the guards. every couple of weeks to keep them fresh and let them see their families. Inside the packet would be letters from Pa, office paperwork, plus some briefs about charities in which I was involved, all stamped ATTHRH, Prince Henry of Wales. One day the package contained a series of memos from the palace comms team about a delicate matter. Mummy's former butler had penned a tell-all, which actually told nothing. It was merely one man's self-justification, self-centering version of events. My mother once called this butler a dear friend, trusted him implicitly. We did too. Now this. He was milking his disappearance for money. He was milking her disappearance for money. It made my blood boil. I wanted to fly home and confront him. I phoned Pa, announced that I was getting on a plane. I'm sure it was the one and only conversation I had with him while I was in Australia. He, and then in a separate phone call, Willie talked me out of it. All we could do, they both said, was issue a united condemnation. So we did, or they did. I had nothing to do with the drafting. Personally, I'd have gone much further. In measured tones, it called out the butler for his treachery and publicly requested a meeting with him to uncover his motives and explore his so-called revelations. The butler answered us publicly, saying he welcomed such a meeting, but not for any constructive purpose. To one newspaper, he vowed, I'd love to give them a piece of my mind. He wanted to give us a piece of his mind? I waited anxiously for the meeting. I counted the days. Of course, it didn't happen. I didn't know why. I assumed the palace squashed it. I told myself, shame. I thought of that man as the one errant steer that got away that summer. 43. I finally recall now how I learned about the first man trying to sneak onto the farm. Maybe from George? While we were out mustering, I do remember that it was the local police who nabbed the intruder and got rid of him. December 2003. The police were pleased with themselves, but I was glum. I knew what was coming. Pups were like ants. They were never just one. Sure enough, the very next day, two more crept onto the farm. Time to go. I owed so much to the Hills, I didn't want to repay them by ruining their lives. I didn't want to be the cause of them losing the one resource more precious than water, privacy. I thanked them for 9 of the best weeks of my life and flew home, arriving just before Christmas. I went straight to the club my first night home, and the next night, and the next. The press thought I was still in Australia, and I decided their ignorance gave me carte blanche. One night, I met a girl, chatted with her over drinks. I didn't know she was a page 3 girl. That was the accepted misogynistic objectifying term for young topless women featured each day on page 3 of Rupert Murdoch's The Sun. I wouldn't have cared if I'd known. She seemed smart and fun. I left the club wearing a baseball cap, paps everywhere. So much for carte blanche. I tried to blend into the crowd, walked casually down the road with my bodyguard. We went through St. James Square and got into an unmarked police car. Just as we pulled away, a Mercedes with blackout windows jumped the pavement and swiped our car, nearly slamming head-on into the rear passenger door. We could see it coming, the driver not looking ahead, too busy trying to shoot photos. The story in the papers the next morning should have been about Prince Harry nearly being killed by a reckless pap. Instead, it was about Prince Harry meeting and supposedly kissing a page 3 girl. along with much frantic commentary about the horrors of despair dating such a fallen woman. Third in line to the throne, dating her, the snobbery, the classism was nauseating. The out of order priorities were baffling, but it all greatly enhanced my sense of joy and relief at running away. Again, gap year, part two. Days later, I was on a plane to Lesotho. Better yet, it was decided that I could take along a mate. The plan, once upon a time, had been to go with Hennes. In his stead, I now asked George. 44. Lesotho was beautiful, but also one of the grimiest places on earth. It was the epicenter of the global AIDS pandemic, and in 2004, the government had just declared a medical disaster. Tens of thousands had fallen to the disease, and the nation was turning into one vast orphanage. Here and there, you'd glimpse young children running about, lost looks on their faces. Where's Daddy? Where's Mummy? George and I signed up to help at several charities and schools. We were both we were both bowled over by the lovely people we met, their resilience, their grace, their courage, and good cheer in the face of so much suffering. We worked as hard as we had worked on his farm, gladly and eagerly. We built schools, we repaired schools, we mixed gravel, poured concrete, whatever was needed. In this same spirit of service, I agreed one day to perform a task that might otherwise have been unthinkable, an interview. If I truly wanted to shine a light on conditions here, I had no choice. I'd have to cooperate with the dreaded press. But this was more than cooperating. This would be my first ever solo session with a reporter. We met on a grassy hillside early one morning. He started by asking, why this place, of all places? I said that children in Lesotho were in trouble and I loved children, understood children, so naturally I wanted to help. He pressed, why did I love children? I gave my best guess, my incredible immaturity. I was being glib, but the reporter chuckled and moved on to the next question. The subject of children had opened the door to the subject of my childhood, and that was the gateway to the only subject he or anyone really wanted to ask me about. Do you think about her a lot through something like this? I looked off, down the hillside, responded with a series of disjointed words. Unfortunately, it's been a long time now. Not for me, but for most people, it's been a long time since she's died. But the stuff that's come out has been bad. All the stuff that's come out, all those tapes. I was referring to recordings my mommy had made before her death, a kind of quasi-confessional which had just been leaked to the press to coincide with release of the butler's memoir, 7 years after being hounded into hiding. My mother was still being hounded and libeled. It didn't make sense. In 1997, there had been a nationwide reckoning, a period of collective remorse and reflection among all Britons. Everyone had agreed that the press was a pack of monsters, but consumers accepted blame as well. We all needed to do better, most people said. Now, many years later, all was forgotten. History was repeating itself daily, and I told the reporter it was a shame. Not a momentous declaration, but it represented the first time that either Willie or I had ever spoken publicly about Mummy. I was amazed to be the one going first. Willie always went first in all things, and I wondered how this would go over with him, with the world, but especially with Pa. Not well, Marco told me later. Pa was dead set against me addressing that topic. He didn't want either of his sons speaking about Mummy for fear it would cause a stir, distract from his work, and perhaps shine an unflattering light on Camilla. Finally, with a completely false air of bravado, I shrugged and said to the reporter, "Bad news sells. Simple as that." Speaking of bad news, the reporter now referenced my most recent scandal, the page 3 girl, of course. He mentioned that some were wondering if I'd really learned anything from my visit to the rehab clinic. Had I truly converted? I don't remember if he used that word converted, but at least one paper had. Did Harry need to be converted? Harry, the heretic. I could barely make out the reporter through the sudden red mist. How are we even talking about this? I blurted something I blurted something about not being normal, which caused the reporter's mouth to fall open. Here we go. He was getting his headline, his news fix. Where were his eyes rolling up into his head? And I was supposed to be the addict? I explained what I meant by normal. I didn't lead a normal life because I couldn't lead one. Even my father reminds me that unfortunately, Willie and I can't be normal. I told the reporter that no one but Willie understood what it was like to live in this surreal fishbowl, in which normal events were treated as abnormal, and the abnormal was routinely normalized. That was what I was trying to say, starting to say. But then I took another look down at the hillside: poverty, disease, orphans, death. It rendered everything else rubbish. In Lesotho, no matter what you were going through, you were well off compared to others. I suddenly felt ashamed and wondered if the journalist had sense enough to be ashamed too. Sitting here above all this misery and talking about page 3 girls? Come on. After the interview, I went and found George and we drank beers. A lot of beer, gallons of beer. I believe that was also the night I smoked an entire shopping bag of weed. I don't recommend it. Then again, it might have been another night, hard to be precise when it comes to a shopping bag full of weed. I tell you, the hyperbole is phenomenal in this novel, in this book, where Harry's talking about weed, smoking a bag of weed. Like seriously, Harry, a shopping bag of weed in one go. Oh boy. All right, guys, we are going to read 45. George and I flew from Lesotho to Cape Town to meet up with some mates and Marco. March 2004. We were staying at the home of the Consulate General, and one night we talked about having some people over for dinner. Just one small problem. We didn't know anyone in Cape Town. But wait, that wasn't completely true. I'd met someone years earlier, a girl from South Africa, at the Berkshire Polo Club, Chelsea. I remembered her being different. I went through my phone, found her number, gave her a call, Marco. Give her a call, Marco said. Really? Why not? To my shock, the number worked, and she answered. Stammering, I reminded her who I was, said I wasn't in her town, wondered if she might like to come over. She sounded unsure. She sounded as if she didn't believe it was me. Flustered, I handed the phone to Marco, who promised that it was really me and that the invitation was sincere and that the evening would be very low key, nothing to worry about, pain free, maybe even fun. She asked if she could bring her girlfriend and her brother. Of course, the more the merrier. Hours later, there she was, sailing through the door. Turned out my memory hadn't lied. She was different. That was the word that had come to mind when I first met her, and it immediately came to mind now. And then again and again during the barbecue. Different. Unlike so many people I knew, she seemed wholly unconcerned with appearances, with propriety, with royalty. Unlike so many girls I met, she wasn't visibly fitting herself for a crown the moment she shook my hand. She seemed immune to that common affliction sometimes called throne syndrome. It was similar to the effect that actors and musicians have on people, except with actors and musicians, the root cause is talent. I had no talent, so I'd been told again and again. And thus, all reactions to me had nothing to do with me. They were down to my family, my title, and consequently, they always embarrassed me because they were so unearned. I'd always wanted to know what it might be like to meet a woman and not have her eyes widen at the mention of my title, but instead to widen them myself, using my mind, my heart. With Chelsea, that seemed a real possibility. Not only was she uninterested in my title, she seemed bored by it all. Oh, you're a prince. Yawn. She knew nothing about my biography, less than nothing about my family. Granny, Willie, Pa, who are they? Better yet, she was remarkably incurious. She probably didn't even know about my mother. She was likely too young to recall the tragic events of August 1997. What are you talking about? Why am I not sleeping? Why should I be sleeping? It's the morning. I wake up at least 4:30, 5 o'clock every morning when I'm home. I don't need to be asleep. I need to be up and getting things done. I couldn't be sure this was true, of course. Because of Chelsea's credit, we didn't talk about it. Instead, we talked about the main thing we had in common: Africa. Chelsea, born and raised in Zimbabwe, now living in Cape Town, loved Africa with all her soul. Her father owned a big game farm, and that was the fulcrum of the world. Though she had enjoyed her years at a British boarding school, Stowe, she had always hurried home for the holidays. I told her I understood. I told her about my life-changing experiences in Africa, my first formative trips. I told her about the strange visitations from the leopard. She nodded. She got it. Brilliant. Africa does offer moments like that, if you are ready, if you are worthy. At some point in the evening, I told her I'd soon be entering the army. I couldn't gauge her reaction. Maybe she had none. At least it didn't seem a deal breaker. Then I told her that George and Marco and I were all heading off the next day to Botswana. We were going to meet up with Addie. Some others float upriver. Come with us. She smiled shyly, gave it a moment's thought. She and her girlfriend had other plans. Oh, too bad. Hey boo, how are you doing? Been so much. And what is this you're getting done, ma'am? Leave me alone, my child. I'm reading. You know that's what I do. Yeah, I like to read, so I read. And when I read, I share it with people around the world. Because that's what you do. When you love something, you share it. You don't keep it to yourself. Just like you sharing me with the world and me sharing you, that's what you do with the things you love and the people you love, right? Okay, my child. Why are you not sleeping? You probably came home from work and stayed up all night. But let me continue. Let me continue from the last paragraph. She smiled shyly, gave it a woman's thought. She and her girlfriend had other plans. Oh, too bad. But they'd cancel them, she said. They'd love to come with us. I think some things you should keep to yourself. No, I can't. Oh, you didn't work. Okay, well, we'll talk later then. 46. We spent 3 days walking, laughing, drinking, mingling with the animals, not just wild animals. By chance, we met up with a snake wrangler who showed us his cobra, his rattlesnake. He manipulated the snakes up and down his shoulders, his arms, giving us a private show. Later that night, Chelsea and I had our first kiss under the stars. George, meanwhile, fell head over heels in love with her girlfriend while the time came. Well, gonna do both and snooze. Okay, you're going to bed soon. Okay, my love, go ahead. I know I know you've probably been up all night. And here I am. George, meanwhile, fell head over heels in love with her girlfriend. When the time came for Chelsea and her girlfriend to go home, and George to go back to Australia, and Marco to go back to London, there were sad goodbyes all around. Suddenly, I found myself alone in the bush with just Addie. What now? We heard about the camp nearby. Two filmmakers were doing a wildlife documentary, and we were invited to go round and meet them. We jumped into a Land Cruiser and soon found ourselves in the middle of a raucous bush party. Men and women drinking, dancing, all wearing bizarre animal masks made from cardboard and pipe cleaners. An Okavango carnival. The leaders of this mayhem were a couple in their 30s, Tej and Mike. They were the filmmakers, I gathered. In fact, they owned the whole film company, plus this camp. I introduced myself, complimented them on their ability to throw a truly epic bash. They laughed and said they were going to pay for it tomorrow. Both had to get up early for work. I asked if I could tag along. I'd love to see how the filmmaking was done. They looked at me, then at each other. They knew who I was, and while it was surprising enough to meet me in the bush, the idea of hiring me as a helper was a lot to take in. Mike said, "Course you can come, but you'll have to work, lift heavy boxes, lug cameras around." I could see from their faces that they expected that to be the end of it. I smiled and said, "Sounds good." They were shocked and pleased. It felt something like love at first sight on both sides. Tej and Mike were Afrikaans. She was from she was from Cape Town and he was from Nairobi. She had been born in Italy, however, spent her first years in Milan, and took special pride in her Milanese roots, the source of her soulfulness, she said, which was as close to a boast as you would ever hear from Tej. She had even grown up speaking Italian, though she had forgotten it, she said, sadly, except she hadn't. Anytime she went into a hospital, she shocked everyone by coming out of the anesthetic speaking fluent Italian. Mike had grown up on a farm, learned to ride horses not long after he had learned to walk. By chance, his next door neighbor was one of the first ever wildlife filmmakers. Every time Mike got a free minute, he'd run next door and sit with his neighbor, barrage him with questions. Mike had found his one true calling, and the neighbor recognized it, fostered it. Both Tej and Mike were talented, brilliant, and wholly devoted to wildlife. I wanted to spend as much time as possible with these two, not just on this trip, but in general. The problem was, would they let me? I'd often caught I'd often catch Tej looking in my direction, sizing me up, a curious smile on her face, as though I were something wild that had unexpectedly wandered into the camp. But instead of shooting me or using me, as many would have done, she reached out and petted me. Decades of observing wildlife had given her a feel of wildness, a reverence for it as a virtue, and even a basic right. She and Mike were the first people ever to cherish whatever wildness was still inside me, whatever hadn't been lost to grief and paps. They were outraged that others wanted to eliminate this last bit, that others were keen to put me into a cage, or that trip, or perhaps the next. I asked Tej and Mike how they'd met. They smiled guiltily. Mutual friends, Mike mumbled. Blind date, Tej whispered. The setting was a small restaurant. When Mike walked in, Tej was already at the table, her back to the door. She couldn't see Mike. She could only hear his voice. But even before turning around, she knew from the tone, the timbre, the chance, the change in room temperature that she was in big trouble. They got on beautifully over dinner, and the next day, Tej went to Mike's place for coffee. She nearly fainted when she walked in. On the top shelf of his bookcase was a book by her grandfather, Robert Audrey, a legendary scientist, essayist, writer. He had won an Oscar nomination for the screenplay of Gortoon. In addition to her grandfather's book, Mike had all Tej's other favorites arranged in the same order as they were arranged on her own shelves. She put her hand to her mouth. This was synchronicity. This was a sign. She never went back to her apartment except to pack her stuff. She and Mike had been together ever since. They they told me this story around the campfire with Marco and that lot. The campfire was central, but, but with Tej and Mike, it was sacrosanct. The same drinks went around, the same riveting stories, but it felt more ritualistic. There were few places where I'd felt closer to truth or more alive. Tej saw it. She could tell how at home I felt with them. She said, I think your body was born in Britain, but your soul was born here in Africa. Possibly the highest compliment I'd ever received. Let's see who's in the chat. Tani's in the chat. Good morning, sis. Good morning. How are you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you. Hey, Jordan, what's up? Jordan says he got a premiere today. Oh, wonderful. I should see it when I go back to go scroll through YouTube again this morning for a little 10 minutes. Because according to my schedule, I got 10 minutes left in the day to scroll through YouTube. So I will see it. After a few days of walking with them, eating with them, falling in love with them, I felt an overwhelming peace and an equally overwhelming need to see Chelsea again. What to do? I wondered. How to make it happen? How to get into Cape Town without the press seeing and ruining it? Addie said, let's drive. Drive? Huh? Yes. Brilliant. It was only 2 days after all. We jumped into a car, drove without stopping, drinking whiskey and gobbling chocolate for energy. I arrived at Chelsea's front door barefoot, scruffy, crowned with a filthy beanie, a huge smile creasing my dirty face. She gasped, then laughed, then opened the door a bit wider. 47. Chelsea and I learned an important lesson. Africa was Africa, but Britain was always Britain. Soon after we arrived back at Heathrow, we were packed. Never fun for me, but not a shock either. There had been a few years after Mommy's disappearance when I'd hardly ever been packed, but now it was constant. I advised Chelsea to treat it like a chronic illness, something to be managed. But she wasn't sure she wanted to have a chronic illness. I told her I understood, perfectly valid feeling, but this was my life, and if she wanted to share any part of it, she'd have to share this too. You get used to it, I lied. Thereafter, I put the chances at 50-50, maybe 60-40, I'd ever see Chelsea again. Odds were the press would cost me another person I cared about. I tried to reassure myself that it was fine, that I didn't really have time for a relationship just then. I had work to do. For starters, I was facing the entrance exams required for the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. They took 4 days, and they were nothing like exams at Eton. There was some bookwork, some written stuff, but mostly there were tests for psychological toughness and leadership skills. Turned out I had both. I passed with flying colors. I was delighted. My trouble concentrating, my trauma over my mother, none of that came into play. None of that counted against me with the British Army. On the contrary, I discovered those things made me all the more ideal. The army was looking for lads like me. That's what you say, young man. Parents divorced, moms dead, unresolved grief or psychological trauma. Step this way. Along with news that I'd passed, I received a report date several months away, which meant I'd have time to gather my thoughts, tied up loose ends, even better, time to spend with Chelsea. If she'd have me, she would. She invited me to come back to Cape Town, meet her parents. I did, and liked them instantly. They were impossible not to like. They enjoyed funny stories, gin and tonics, good food, stalking. Her father was beer-sized, broad-shouldered, cuddly, but also a definite alpha. Her mother was petite, an amazing listener, and a frequent bestower of epic hugs. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't want to put any carts before any horses, but I thought if you designed in-laws from the ground up, you couldn't do much better than these guys. 48. There must have been something in the air just as I was embarking on my new romance. Pa announced that he had decided to marry. He had asked Granny's permission and she had granted it. Reluctantly, it was reported. Despite Willie and me urging him not to, Pa was going ahead. We pumped his hand, wished him well, no hard feelings. We recognized that he was finally going to be with the woman he loved, the woman he had always loved, the woman fate might have intended for him in the first place. Whatever bitterness or sorrow we felt over the closing of another loop in Mummy's story, we understood that it was beside the point. Also, we sympathize with Pa and Camilla as a couple. They had taken star-crosses to new levels. After years of thwarted longing, they were now just a few steps from happiness, and new spectacles kept appearing. First, there was the controversy over the nature of the ceremony. Courtiers instead insisted it would have to be a civil ceremony because Pa, as future Supreme Governor of the Church of England, couldn't marry a divorcee in the church. That set off a furious debate about the locations. If the civil ceremony were to be held at Windsor Castle, the couple's first choice, then Windsor would first need to be licensed for civil weddings. And if that were to happen, then everyone in Britain would be allowed to have their civil weddings there. No one wanted that. The decision was therefore made that wedding would take place at Windsor Guildhall. But then the Pope died. Bewildered, I asked Willie, what's the Pope got to do with Pa? Loads, it turned out. Pa and Camilla didn't want to get married on the same day the Pope was being laid to rest. Bad karma, less press, more to the point. Granny wanted Pa to represent her at the funeral. The wedding plans were changed yet again, delay after delay. If you listened carefully, you could hear, wafting across the palace grounds, the shrieks and groans of despair. You just couldn't tell whose they were, the wedding planners or Camilla's or Pa's. Other than feeling sorry for them, I couldn't help but think that some force in the universe, Mommy, was blocking rather than blessing their union. Maybe the universe delays what it disapproves of. When the wedding did finally take place without Granny, of course, who chose not to attend, it was almost cathartic for everyone, even me. Standing near the altar, I mostly kept my head bowed, eyes on the floor, just as I had during Mummy's funeral. But I did sneak several long peeks at the groom and the bride, and each time I thought, good for you, though also, goodbye. I knew without question that this marriage would take power away from us, not in any real sense, not in any deliberate or malicious way, but nevertheless away. We were entering a new space, a closed space, a tightly insular space. Willie and I would see less of Pa, I predicted, and that left me with mixed feelings. I didn't relish losing a second parent, and I had complex feelings about gaining a step parent who, I believed, had recently sacrificed me on the altar, on her personal PR altar. But I saw Pa's smile, and it was hard to ignore with that, to argue with that, and hardly still to deny the cause. Camilla. I wanted so many things, but I was surprised to discover at their wedding that one of the things I wanted most still was for my father to be happy. In a funny way, I even wanted Camilla to be happy. Maybe she'd be less dangerous if she was happy. There are published reports that Willie and I snuck out of the church and hung just married signs on their car. I don't think so. I might have hung a sign, be happy, if I'd thought of it at the time. I do remember watching them drive off and thinking, they are happy. They are really happy. Damn, I'd like all of us to be happy. All right, that's where we're going to stop for today, guys. That is chapter 8, chapter 48. We have just concluded. When we come back tomorrow, we will move on to chapter 49. And this in this last paragraph where Harry says, maybe she'd be less dangerous if she was happy. That has given me a lot of thought. Happy people are less dangerous after all. Thank you so much for listening, guys. It was my absolute pleasure reading and having you listen to me while I read. I enjoyed it and I hope you did too. That's going to be it from me for today. Until next time, this is Trev from Trevessence, where your journey matters. Have yourselves a fantastic day, guys.